Part 1. Preliminaries. The inland sea of Japan was still veiled in darkness when the anchorage at Hashirajima began to awaken. On board the aircraft carrier Akagi, white-clad crewmen, ghostly in the deep twilight on the forecastle, began raising the ship's anchors. The clatter of the capstan was overlain with the bright sound of spraying water as the foredeck gang played hoses along the dripping anchor chains, washing them clean of the harbour's black mud. All around Akagi, just barely discernible in the gloom, lay dozens of great grey warships, many of them weighing anchor as well. Nautical twilight was at 0437, but the dark waters of the bay, sheltered by the mountainous islands, would remain shrouded in grey until well after sunlight dappled the hilltops. Akagi would sortie around dawn. The date was 27th of May, 1942. Those in the deck gang chatted in tight little knots as they worked. The topics of conversation were the age-old harps of all sailors' wives and girlfriends, home, and what was likely to be on today's menu. Hopefully this morning's fare would be something soothing to the stomach, as many of the men were rather hungover. The drinking on board Akagi the previous night had started early and ended late. The crew on the foredeck knew this much. As tedious as raising anchor could be, duty on the foredeck was still vastly to be preferred to the job of cleaning out the lavatories this morning. Only the bravest or most coerced of men would venture into those spaces after the excesses of the night before. By far the prevalent topic of conversation, though, concerned the operation ahead. Something was up. The activity in Hashirajima this morning made that much clear. It was known that a large banquet had been held on board Combined Fleet's flagship 2 nights previously for the fleet's commanders. The top brass didn't throw parties just for laughs. Akagi was headed somewhere important. Where to was anybody's guess, though. Many of the men still sported suntans from their recent operations in the South Pacific, and it was possible they might be headed there again, either to Truk, Japan's great sanctuary in the Carolines, or perhaps Singapore. They might even be returning to Staring Bay in the Celebes, which had been their base of operations for much of March. Others didn't think so. The scuttlebutt around the fleet was that some of the ships provisioning at Kure lately had been fitted for cold weather duty. That meant Akagi could be headed north. Having attacked Pearl Harbor in December, the crewmen knew that the North Pacific was no joke. The weather had been atrocious, and high seas had washed several men overboard. Hopefully, though, the weather in June would be a little more forgiving. Located in the seclusion of Hiroshima Bay, the fastness of Hashirajima was perfectly situated to give access to the open ocean within a few hours' steaming. It was Japan's equivalent of Britain's Scapa Flow or America's Hampton Roads, a vast anchorage where the entire fleet could be safely sheltered close to its logistical centres and the sea, and yet protected from snooping enemies. It was ringed with anti-aircraft weapons, interdicted by anti-torpedo netting, and ceaselessly patrolled by smaller warships. Phone lines laid to the main mooring buoys meant that the fleet's flagships enjoyed secure communication back to Naval General Headquarters in Tokyo. Hashirajima lay just 22 nautical miles from the lively port city of Hiroshima. Closer yet, 16 miles to the northeast, lay the great naval arsenal and shipyard of Kure. Kure had built an appreciable portion of the Japanese Navy. It was also close to the Naval Academy, which was located just west of the yard on the island of Itajima. It was here, in the red brick buildings built in deliberate imitation of the British Royal Navy, that the Emperor's naval officers were trained. The combination of Kure's yards, Etajima's academy, and Hashirajima's anchorage made this area of the inland sea the very cradle of the Japanese Navy. From where she lay, Akagi's crewmen could see the battleship anchorage near Hashirajima Island. There lay the 7 great dreadnoughts of First Fleet, the symbols for the last 25 years of Japan's undeniable status as a major navy. At their head was the largest battleship ever built, the 69,000-ton Yamato, which had become operational just 2 days earlier. Flagship of Combined Fleet and home to its commander, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, Her bulk overshadowed every other warship in the bay. For many officers in the Navy, her enormous guns still represented the apotheosis of naval power. Bristling with weapons, her girth made her appear almost like a mountain rising out of the still waters. Yet her swept-back stack, undulating deck and streamlined superstructure lent her a grace that seemed curiously out of place on such a behemoth. The battleships wouldn't be sailing this morning. No surprise there, joked Akagi's crewman. They hadn't done anything during the entire war. For them, the battleships were irrelevant, nothing more than a symbol of a bygone era. Worse yet, in the workaholic culture of the Imperial Navy, which popular law had it, operated 8 days a week, the battleships were seen as slackers. While Akagi and her companions had been winning unprecedented victories, the battleships had largely lain at anchor, leaving only to conduct gunnery practice in the nearby Iyonada waterway, and earning in the process the unwanted sobriquet of the Hashirajima fleet. Only the 4 fast battleships of Battle Division 3, hereafter rendered as Bat Div 3, which had been stalwart companions of Akagi's for the last 6 months, were excluded from the scorn heaped on the slower battle wagons. Yamato might be pretty to look at, but Akagi's men knew, and everyone else in the anchorage knew, that the carriers, in particular these 4 carriers, were the Imperial Navy's superstars. They were the Navy's samurai sword, the gleaming blade that had humbled Japan's enemies at Pearl Harbor and across the breadth of the Pacific. The finest naval aviation force in the world. Akagi was flagship of Carrier Division 1, Daiichi KK Sentai, referred to hereafter as Car-Div 1. She flew the flag of Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, commander of 1st Air Fleet and its tactical incarnation, the 1st Mobile Striking Force, Daiichi Kid Butai 3. Akagi was enormous, at 855 feet the longest carrier in the Imperial Navy, displacing more than 41,000 tons. Her architecture immediately betrayed her as a hybrid carrier constructed on top of what had originally been intended as a capital ship. Her lower hull was all sleek battlecruiser, its most prominent feature being her massive, rakish bow. It was a bow built for speed, not seakeeping a huge meat cleaver of a prow. Near the stern lingered another vestige of her original design. 6 casemated 8-inch guns, set 3 to a side down near the waterline. Constructed at a time when no one was sure how carriers would operate with the battle fleet, these weapons had been intended to help Akagi fend off enemy cruisers. Now they were simply wasted displacement. Above the main deck, her clean lines quickly gave way to a crazy quilt of upper works enclosing her hangars. Her cliff-like sides sported a maze of catwalks, huge grills covering engine ventilator intakes, and a forest of slanting supports for her walkways, gun galleries, and fire control equipment. A gargantuan downswept funnel sprouted from the ship's starboard side. Her improbably high flight deck towered 6 stories above the ocean's surface. Yet, despite the mishmash appearance, she had a curious balance and power in her lines. She wasn't a pretty ship, but she wasn't to be trifled with either. It was Akagi's 31-knot speed that had first recommended her to the Japanese as a carrier. When the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was signed, Akagi was still on the building ways. Instead of being scrapped, she and her sister, Amagi, had been slated for conversion to carriers in much the same fashion that the Americans had converted battlecruisers Lexington and Saratoga. Both navies had tentatively decided through the operations of their respective carrier prototypes, H. Esch and Langley, that they needed larger carriers than they currently had, with bigger flight decks and a healthy margin of speed. Battlecruisers, with their size and swiftness, were perfect for the job. As a result, work on Akagi had been stopped long enough to redraw her plans. What emerged was almost bizarre. A design with 3 flight decks forward to allow simultaneous takeoffs of multiple types of aircraft, supported by 3 separate aircraft hangars. Her conversion also proved enormously expensive at $53,000, $36.45 million. She was by far the most costly warship the Imperial Navy had ever built. Not only that, but within 8 years of her commissioning, it had been decided that her original triple flight deck configuration was unusable, owing to the ever-increasing weight, and hence take-off room required, of modern carrier aircraft. She re-entered the yards in 1935 for another expensive refit. She emerged in 1938 with a full-length flight deck and an island on her port side. Akagi and Hiri were the only carriers in the world whose islands were located to port. This unorthodox configuration had come about as the result of design studies in the mid-1930s that had suggested that turbulence over the flight deck aft, which affected aircraft during landing, could be reduced by moving the island away from the ship's exhaust gases. In the event, the portside arrangement actually made things somewhat worse, but there was no helping that now. This was not to say that Akagi hadn't been useful during her first 8 years, far from it. It was on board her and Kaga that Japanese naval aviation had largely been created. Japanese carrier doctrine had been predicated on Akagi's capabilities. She was the first Japanese vessel that possessed the size, speed, and aircraft handling facilities to justify being called a true carrier. Even now, as the oldest of the 4 carriers in harbour, she was arguably still the most useful fast enough to keep up with almost any battle force, yet larger and better protected than her smaller compatriots in Carrier Division 2, hereafter Cardiv 2. Only the spanking new Shikaku and Zuikaku clearly eclipsed her. As it happened, Akagi would be sailing under a new skipper for this operation. The tall and angular Captain Hasegawa Kichi, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, had been relieved by Captain Aoki Taijiro, 52. Aoki was a spare, compact man who sported a trim little moustache. Most recently, he had been the commander of a floatplane training squadron, not exactly a glamorous assignment, although he had commanded the seaplane carrier Mizuho previously. This was his first combat posting, making him the only carrier commander in Kid Butai with no battle experience. However, Akagi's crew was well stocked with experienced officers. Undoubtedly the most important of these, as far as the flight operations was concerned, was her air officer, Shike Chich, Commander Masuda Shogo. The Hikeichi was in charge of orchestrating both the flight deck and the hangar decks. He also directed the ship's combat air patrol aircraft when they were aloft. It was his job to ensure that the ship was capable of carrying out the captain's orders to arm, launch, and recover aircraft when required. Masuda, the father of 4 daughters, was not a flamboyant individual, but he was highly capable, having been with the ship since the beginning of the war. Akagi's sister ship, Amagi, had never joined the fleet. She was wrecked on the ways during the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Lacking any further battlecruiser hulls, the Navy had selected a battleship hull scheduled to be scrapped under the Washington Naval Treaty. Kaga was thus saved from the scrapyard and towed instead to Yokosuka to be completed as a carrier. The same lengthy building time and astronomical cost as Akagi had preceded her commissioning in March 1928. Kaga, too, had initially been designed with triple flight decks, but she lacked Akagi's speed. Her 25 knots was barely sufficient to hold station with her faster division mate. By 1934 it was clear that she was the least serviceable of the pair, and she went into the yards for a refit. In the process, Yokosuka's yard workers ripped the guts out of her propulsion plant and completely re-engined her. She emerged in 1935 with better hangar facilities, but still far from speedy, although new engines and a slight lengthening of her hull had raised its speed another 3 knots. Her flight deck, though, was generously sized, towering above the water much like Akagi, and making for a wide, dry platform for takeoffs and landings. All in all, Kaga had an appealing homey dumpiness about her. She was, by all accounts, a happy ship to serve on board. Part 2. Commanders and Ships. Kaga's commander, Captain Okada Jisaku, was 48 years old, the same age as the skippers of both Soryu and Hiryu. A severe, comely man, he had been associated with aviation for much of his career. Starting as a squadron commander, he later rose to command seaplane carrier Notoro and later the light carrier Ryujo. Following a posting as a commander in the Navy Technical Department, Kansei Honbu, he came on board Kaga in September 1941. Okada had just inherited a new Hikocho, Commander Amagai Takahisa, who had been carrier Hiryu's Hikocho since the outbreak of hostilities. Amagai was apparently something of a bumpkin. One fighter pilot who knew him described him as both artless and rather sloppy in appearance. For all that, though, his simplicity of character made him approachable, and he was always happy to talk with anyone and everyone. Further off, but still easily visible from the flight decks Kaga and Akagi, were the two ships of Cardiff II Hiryu and Soryu. Whereas the ships of Cardiff I were both notable for their size, Cardiff II was characterized by speed. Soryu, the elder of the pair, having joined the fleet in 1937, was the progenitor of Japan's standard fleet carrier design. Built around a cruiser-style hull and power plant, which generated a prodigious 152,000 shaft horsepower, she was capable of cranking out 35 knots. She was the fastest aircraft carrier in the world when she was launched. In fact, she could outrun Kaga at only 40% power. Unlike Cardiff I's ships, Soryu had been designed from the keel up as a carrier. Her hangar decks, instead of simply being plopped down on top of an existing hull like Akagi's and Kaga's, had been smoothly fared into the structure of the hull itself, making her profile lower, her lines cleaner, and her flight deck unfortunately wetter. Soryu seemed almost out of place next to the hulking members of Cardiff I. She was small, lean, almost elegant. However, her diminutive size and delicate features betrayed her weaknesses, light construction, and a near total lack of armour. Thus far, though, her defensive characteristics had never been tested. Soryu was commanded by Captain Yanagimoto Ryusaku. Yanagimoto was an intensely handsome man, possessing high cheekbones, a delicate mouth, and wide-set, intelligent eyes. His credentials were equally impressive, having previously served as a naval attaché, a naval war college instructor, and as head of the intelligence section of the Naval General Staff. His reputation in the fleet was that of both a gentleman and a warrior. He was revered for his self-confidence, fairness, and courteous manners to both peers and underlings alike, no small feat in a navy ruled by iron discipline. He and his Hikocho, Commander Kusumoto Ikuto, had been with Soryu since before Pearl Harbor, making them unquestionably the most experienced air operations duo in the fleet. Soryu's compatriot, Hiryu, was really only a stepsister. Entering service in 1939, she shared much of Soryu's general layout, but with some notable differences. Her hull was a bit wider, and her island was located to port like Akagi's. Her bow had been plated up an extra deck, flattening her sheer forward. As a result, she had boxier, more severe lines than Soryu, although she shared her sister's speed. Hiryu was currently the flagship of the fiery Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon, commander of Cardiff II. Until a month earlier, he had flown his flag in Soryu, but in early May, Yamaguchi had decided to avail himself of Hiryu's more commodious command spaces. Her bridge was the largest and most modern of the four carriers, and therefore more convenient for housing the admiral's staff. Hiryu was commanded by Captain Kaku Tomeo. Kaku, like Kaga's Captain Okada, was an early proponent of air power. As early as 1927, he had been participating in the development of the Navy's air doctrine, first as a student at the Naval War College, and later as an air group commander and ship's captain. Kaku had the distinction of being the only aviator among the four carrier commanders in Kidbutai. He was an intimidating figure, a burly man whose mouth fell naturally into a ferocious scowl. Kaku's new Hikocho was Commander Kawaguchi Susumu, a former fighter pilot. In addition to Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, two other carriers ought to have been sortying this morning as well, the brand new Shokaku and Zuikaku of Carrier Division 5, hereafter Cardiff 5. Cardiff 5 was an integral part of Kid Butai, having been incorporated into Nagumo's battle force upon Zuikaku's commissioning in September 1941. Though they were inexperienced vessels, their large size and excellent aircraft handling facilities had made them indispensable for December's Pearl Harbor operation. Under the command of Rear Admiral Hara Chuichi, they had operated with Kid Butai continuously since then. However, in mid-April, Cardiff 5 had been detached to support the Japanese landings against Port Moresby in New Guinea, slated for early May. There, on 7 to 8 May in the Coral Sea north of Australia, they had been put through the ringer. An American carrier force had appeared unexpectedly, and in the ensuing battle the two yearlings had suffered heavily. Shokaku had sustained 3 bomb hits, knocking her out of the battle. Zuikaku had escaped physical damage, but her air group had been shredded. Both carriers were now at Kure. Shokaku had made port on 17 May, having run a gauntlet of American submarines, and very nearly capsizing in the process as a result of the rough treatment on her damaged bow. Zuikaku had docked 4 days later. Shokaku would ultimately spend the latter half of June in dry dock. Zuikaku was nominally operational, but her air group was not, and would not be fully reconstituted for months. Thus, both carriers were out of the picture for the current operation. If the rank and file on board Kid Butai were worried about this diminution of their strength, they weren't showing it. Why should they? Nagumo's remaining carriers were an elite formation with or without Cardiff 5. Kid Butai had ranged across the Pacific Ocean during the first 6 months of the war, wreaking havoc, running up a nearly unbroken string of victories, and humiliating Allied naval forces. During Kid Butai's opening assault on Pearl Harbor, they had sunk or disabled the better part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleship force and crushed U.S. air power on Hawaii. Shortly afterward, Soryu and Hiryu had provided air cover for the second invasion of Wake Island. Following this, Kid Butai refitted briefly in Japan before moving into southern waters to cover operations in Malaya and the Indies. On 19th of February 1942, as part of the opening moves against Java, the striking force had launched a major raid against the northern Australian harbour of Port Darwin, causing heavy damage and effectively shutting down the port. In early April 1942, Kid Butai, composed of Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku and Zuikaku, raided the Indian Ocean. The Japanese carriers launched attacks against the British bases of Colombo and Trincomalee on Ceylon. Colombo was hit on the morning of 5 April, causing heavy damage to its port facilities. More important, in the afternoon, the Japanese located the heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall fleeing the scene of the action southward. The Japanese quickly dispatched these vessels with a devastating dive bomber attack. Nagumo's force had retired briefly to the east, returning on 9th of April to attack Trincomalee. In the process, they caught the carrier Hermes and a destroyer and dispatched them in similar fashion before retiring. These raids exposed the enormous gap between Japanese and British naval aviation. For the first time in centuries, the Royal Navy was impotent in the face of a foe that had clearly moved ahead of British practice in a crucial area of naval combat. Kid Butai then returned to Japan for much-needed rest and refitting. Nagumo's ships had been in near-constant operations for 4.5 months and had traversed nearly a third of the globe. Though aircraft losses had been relatively light by the standards of a global conflict, they had still been a serious drain. New replacements needed to be integrated into the air formations and trained. Similarly, the carriers needed dry dock time and maintenance. However, if the crews were looking forward to a leisurely period of R&R in the delightful city of Hiroshima, they were gravely disappointed. Returning to Hashirajima on 22nd April, the carriers had immediately been plunged into frantic preparations for the next sortie. Each ship had been taken in for a quick refit and then began reprovisioning. There had been precious little time for the men to enjoy liberty, though the ferry ride was short and Hiroshima well liked for its May Flower Festival, not to mention its tasty food and pretty girls. Now, a scant month after returning, they were getting ready to leave again. The Navy's work was never done, the men joked. At 0600, Akagi raised her ensign and signalled, "Commence sortie as scheduled." One by one, Kid Butai fell into line and began parading through the anchorage. Light cruiser Nagara headed the column, leading her destroyer squadron. Cruiser Division 8's, hereafter Crew Div 8 flagship Tone, followed, with sister ship Chikuma next, followed by battleships Haruna and Kirishima. At the end of the proud line came Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu and Soryu. Coincidentally, 27 May was also Navy Day, the anniversary of Admiral Togo Heihachiro's spectacular victory over the Russians in 1905, a good omen for victory if ever there was one. Across Japan, the morning dailies were already trumpeting the accomplishments of the Imperial Navy. The English edition of the Japan Times and Advertiser proclaimed that, "This year, Navy Day is not a day of mere remembrance, not a mere reminder. It is a day of fulfillment. The Japanese Navy has not only duplicated the exploits of 37 years ago, it has repeated it time and again, and in an unbelievably greater scale. Navy Day this year is the climax for which all Navy Days of past years have been in preparation." The article concluded that Japan stands today as the premier naval power of the world. It may well presage the rise of Japan in the future history of the world to a position comparable to that which Britain has occupied in the past. It was a heady vision. Indeed, no newspaper reporter who might have had the privilege of witnessing this morning's sortie would have faulted the splendour of the spectacle spread before him. On the decks of every ship in the bay, white-clad crewmen packed the railings. The men on board the warships still at anchor cheered lustily as Nagumo's force promenaded in slow splendour. Kid Butai cheered them back. Though most of them had no idea of the particulars of what was afoot, Operation MI, the assault on the island of Midway, was now underway. On Akagi's bridge stood the man on whom the weight of command for the mission was laid. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, commander of the 1st Mobile Striking Force, was small, gruff, and 55 years of age. A sailor's sailor, he had held numerous sea-going commands on his way up through the ranks. A torpedo expert by training, as a young officer, he had garnered a reputation for dash and intelligence and was considered a rising star within the Navy. Somewhere along the way, though, his earlier drive had been leached away. Perhaps it was simply the onset of premature old age. Once an avid kendo fencer, bouts of arthritis now left him in considerable pain. He wore the command of Kid Butai uneasily. An official photograph, taken of him in a dress uniform dripping in medals, seems to reveal a man distinctly uncomfortable with the image of an admiral, staring with muted supplication at the camera. Perhaps he simply longed for the simpler days, when he was a lower-level commander and spent his time at sea, out of the limelight. The complexity of the new mode of aerial warfare clearly was beyond his ken. Nagumo's true personality is difficult to pin down. It is probable that he, like many men, had different faces for different audiences. His youngest son remembered him as a serious, somewhat brooding father. His ambitions to have his 2 sons follow him into the Navy were destined for disappointment. Nagumo was all business and rarely joked at home, seemingly always consumed with the concerns of a career Navy officer. He was often at sea, leaving his 3 children for long periods of time. To his junior officers he often appeared friendly, evincing the sort of fatherly familiarity that his own son apparently rarely saw. He was always willing to lend them a helping hand and provide advice. He was also given to delegating responsibility to younger men, sometimes too much so. His peers in the admiral's ranks apparently considered him a mixed bag at best, competent, but given to drunken bravado. The mercurial Admiral Ugaki Matome, Chief of Staff for Combined Fleet, disliked Nagumo intensely, and in the privacy of his diary ascribed to him all manner of mental shortcomings, from panics and nerves to simple stupidity. It is unlikely that Nagumo had friendly relations with his chief, Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was a noted member of the faction within the Navy that had supported the Washington Naval Treaty. Nagumo had been a member of the militaristic fleet faction, which opposed the treaty as if it were a national hemlock. Given that Yamamoto's life had been threatened by extremist members of the fleet faction, it can be safely speculated that each man loathed the other. Yamamoto could not have been happy that it was Nagumo who was put in charge of 1st Air Fleet when it was formed in April 1941. This new entity, which concentrated all the large flight decks in the fleet into a single tactical unit, needed to be commanded by a vice admiral. Unfortunately, the more air-minded Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, who had been one of the primary advocates behind 1st Air Fleet's creation, had just been assigned to a different post, leaving Nagumo next in line. According to the Navy's strict rules of seniority, he was given a command for which he was basically ill-suited. It wasn't that Nagumo was a bad officer. Rather, he was largely passive and not terribly innovative, at a moment in history when adaptability would be key to the Navy's fortunes. Nagumo had no real affinity for the supremely powerful weapon that was thrust into his hands. However, by the time of Midway, Nagumo's name was also inextricably linked to the successes of Kid Butai. Though Yamamoto had rebuked him over his performance at Pearl Harbor, he wasn't in any position to remove him from command. When such an action had been suggested by a member of Yamamoto's staff, he had replied that such an action would be the same as killing him. It would be the same thing as asking him to commit harakiri. Besides, such an action would have had to be ratified by the Naval General Staff in any case, and it was known within the circles of Combined Fleet that Naval GHQ could not and would not approve such an action. It's possible, too, that Nagumo's passivity may have been somewhat appealing to the Commander-in-Chief. Admiral Yamamoto was used to having his way, and already had had plenty of internal battles to fight with the Navy establishment in 1941, when trying to get approval for Pearl Harbor. Having a strong-willed commander presiding over the primary implement of that strategic vision could have been quite inconvenient. Yamamoto liked original thinking, as long as it was his, or if it emanated from individuals he could directly control. In Nagumo he found a commander who, though grudging, was at least not inclined to resist his orders. Nagumo grumbled, but he did what he was told. That Kid Butai had won, and won big, for the first 6 months of the war was no real indication of Nagumo's prowess or growth as a carrier commander. At the beginning of the Pacific War, the Japanese Navy had found itself within the happy confluence of 3 key forces: weak opponents, possession of a superior weapons system, in the form of high-quality massed naval air power, and an effective doctrine for its employ. None of Kid Butai's foes had an effective reply to the challenge posed by 6 carriers and some 400 aircraft that could appear and disappear at will. Japanese planes and pilots were so markedly superior that apparently nothing could stand before them. But if Nagumo used this honeymoon period to gain a deeper understanding of the workings of carrier warfare, it does not show in his subsequent actions. Nagumo was merely the ringleader of this travelling circus. He had hardly anything to do with its success. Nagumo's right-hand man was his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Kusaka Ryunosuke. Originally a gunnery officer, he had been posted to Kasumigaura Air Group in 1926, whereupon his career became totally devoted to aviation. Though not a flyer himself, he had commanded both the Hosho and Akagi before being promoted to Rear Admiral in 1937. Kusaka was, by all accounts, devoted to his chief, and became something of an apologist for him after the war. They were both cautious by nature, although Kusaka's personality was more placid and philosophical than that of his dour commander. A Zen Buddhist, he was apparently a skilled negotiator and conciliator. However, there is little to suggest that he possessed an incisive mind. His lectures on aerial tactics at Kasumigaura were remembered by the aviators there as being not so much on aerial tactics as on aerial philosophy. He was, in short, something of a dilettante man who recognized the potential of naval aviation and wanted to be associated with it, but whose training and personal insights into air power were limited. That, in combination with his rather laid-back personality, meant that he was unlikely to take bold actions when the need arose. Kid Butai's other ranking carrier admiral was Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon. The commander of Cardiff II, Yamaguchi was a much different man than his superior. 5 years younger than Nagumo, he seemed ages more youthful and energetic. Photographs of Yamaguchi reveal an odd mixture of features, with high eyebrows, close-set eyes, and an almost feline appearance. He was widely seen within the fleet as being the logical successor to Admiral Yamamoto. He had an impeccable pedigree for higher command, a Naval Staff College graduate, schooling abroad at Princeton University, and extensive sea service. Yamaguchi had worked his way up through command of light cruiser Isuzu, heavy cruiser Otago, and eventually battleship Ise. He had been a member of Japan's naval delegation to the London Naval Conference in 1929 and had also served as naval attaché in Washington, D.C. During the conflict in China, he had commanded the Navy's 1st Combined Air Group and directed its bombing campaign against central China. Though not a pilot, he was respected in the aviation community and had been a vocal supporter of its growth. Yamaguchi appears to have been quite social, which may have furthered his career. An American naval officer who met Yamaguchi in 1923 when he was still a lieutenant observed that he appeared to prefer pleasure to work. Yamaguchi was quite enthusiastic about his American alma mater, Princeton, where he apparently preferred horses, tennis, golf, and liquor to study. The American went on to observe that Yamaguchi did not give the impression of being well-founded professionally, but would be better suited to diplomacy. Yet, despite what his vitae or American social acquaintances might have said, in the final analysis, Yamaguchi fell into the category of man that Chihaya Masatake, himself a commander in the Imperial Navy and a shrewd observer of its failings, would later term the Oriental hero type, rough-hewn, and lacking precision of thought and a clear-cut sense of responsibility in the Western sense of the word. He was, in short, the epitome of the traditional samurai hot-tempered, aggressive to a fault, a man who valued honour as the ultimate virtue. It is clear that Yamaguchi had misgivings about his more passive superior, and indeed of 1st Air Fleet's staff in general. Admiral Ugaki recorded in his diary that Yamaguchi had complained to him on several occasions that 1st Air Fleet headquarters had never taken steps to expand its achievement in battle, grasping an opportunity to do so, or to cope with a change of circumstances. He confided to Ugaki that what was missing in 1st Air Fleet was leadership. The Commander-in-Chief, Nagumo, doesn't say a word, and both the Chief of Staff, Kusaka, and the Senior Staff Officer, Captain Ishii, Kusaka's right-hand man, lack boldness. In his complaints, Yamaguchi found a receptive ear, for Ugaki was hardly impressed with Nagumo himself and urged Yamaguchi to continue recommending his views as much as possible in the future. If true brilliance was to be found in Kid Butai, it lay further down the chain of command. Nagumo's air officer, Commander Genda Minoru, was commonly recognized as the house genius. Like his commander, he wore his mantle somewhat uneasily, but for entirely different reasons. There was no questioning his air credentials. Genda had first made his name as a highly skilled fighter pilot, eventually going so far as to organize a naval acrobatic team to tour Japan. After his run with the Genda Circus, as it came to be known, he had served as an air staff officer in China, flight instructor, and an assistant naval attaché for good measure. Genda was gifted, insightful, and had a firm grasp over the workings of carrier warfare. Indeed, he was largely responsible for creating and shaping the force now under Nagumo's command. He had been handpicked by Yamamoto for his position, and thus far in the war he had performed well. It was Genda who had been the architect of massed naval air power within the fleet, and it was his and Vice Admiral Ozawa's constant nagging of the top brass that had finally prompted Yamamoto to officially create the 1st Air Fleet. Nagumo, with his penchant for delegating to talented juniors, essentially let gender run the show when it came to planning air operations. As far as gender was concerned, this was a mixed blessing. While he was confident in his abilities, to the point of arrogance, according to Kusaka, he was also aware of his limitations. Nagumo rarely critiqued his plans. Gender would have preferred having someone supervising him to ensure that he didn't overlook the obvious. Unfortunately, there was no one else with the necessary insight into aerial matters to do so. The net result was that air operations for Kid Butai were disproportionately the responsibility of a single individual. Nagumo's warships left Hashirajima travelling south, passing between the islands of Yashirojima and Nakajima before turning into the broad Iyo-Nada waterway. The heavily cultivated islands of the inland sea are verdant and steep-sided, rising spectacularly from the blue waters. Fishermen in their boats paused to wave at the grim warships as they cruised along. Kid Butai made its way toward the north entrance of the Bungo Suido, the key waterway that separates Shikoku from the southern island of Kyushu. Entering the narrow channel in single file, the force ploughed south-southeast toward the open ocean, clearing Bungo Suido around noon. Kid Butai's screening vessels began shaking themselves out into an alert cruising disposition. Nagumo's escorts for this mission were well known to the force as a whole. The fast battleships Haruna and Kirishima, the second section of Bat Div 3, were along to provide whatever heavy gunfire might be needed. Both ships were old but had been refitted several times during their long lives. Originally constructed as battle cruisers, they could still crank out 31 knots, and as such were perfect heavy escorts for Kid Butai's carriers. Each mounted 8 14-inch guns and relatively heavy anti-aircraft armament as well. They were in no way equivalent to a modern fast battleship, but could certainly stand up against a heavy cruiser, which was their primary screening role. They could also be called on to initiate a night action against any American forces that might be in the neighborhood if the situation required it. Nagumo's screen commander, Rear Admiral Abe Hiroaki, flew his flag in the heavy cruiser Tone. Both Tony and Chikuma had been built as adjuncts to the carrier forces. Each mounted their 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets forward, leaving the entire rear deck available for floatplane operations. Each ship normally carried 5 aircraft, although on this occasion Tone was missing one of hers. The role of these cruisers was to act as scouts for the fleet through their floatplanes, thereby freeing up the carrier aircraft for offensive operations. The light cruiser Nagara, flagship of Rear Admiral Kimura Susumu, commander of Destroyer Squadron 10, directed a screen of 11 destroyers, Arashi, Nowaki, Hagikaze, Maikaze, Kazagumo, Yugumo, Makigumo, Isokaze, Urakaze, Hamakaze, and Tanikaze. Nagara was an older 5,500-ton cruiser and wasn't much help in a fight, but her role was to act as flagship for the destroyers in her charge, which is where the real surface combat power of the force lay. Each of the destroyers was a new fleet unit, and all of them were armed to the teeth with 5-inch guns and the feared course taking it southeast into the broad Pacific. They would continue in this fashion for the rest of the day before turning east that night and heading toward the objective. The coastline of Shikoku was fading into the distance. Tsuchiya Ryosaku, a third-class seaman from Shizuoka province, still 4 months shy of his 16th birthday, may have had a chance to look over Akagi's railing one last time as the shore vanished behind him. 57-year-old Hodate Ken, a lieutenant commander from Kagoshima, might well have done the same from Soryu's bridge. They were destined to be, respectively, the youngest and oldest of the 3,057 Japanese who would never see their homeland again as a result of Operation MI. Within 10 days, they and the proud carriers they served on would be lying at the bottom of the cold Pacific. Whereas the spectacle surrounding Nagumo's sortie 6 hours earlier had been galer, the mood among his senior officers was quite the opposite. This was not a popular operation, particularly among the staff members of Kid Butai, who worried that Combined Fleet's planning staff was sending them on a fool's errand. Nagumo had been withdrawn and apathetic during the planning phase. Admirals Kusaka, Yamaguchi, and Kondo, along with Captain Kaku of Hiryu, had all been downright hostile to it almost from the outset. Commander Genda, for his part, while not opposed to seeking a decisive battle with the Americans off Midway, also felt that the mission's operational planning left much to be desired. Indeed, to many fleet officers, Operation MI and its concurrent northern counterpart, Operation AL, aimed at the occupation of the Aleutian Islands, appeared to have been simply thrown together. Appearances, in this case, were not deceptive. Operations MI and AL were the unhappy outcome of a lack of real strategic direction on the part of the Japanese military, and the Imperial Navy in particular, in early 1942. To a large degree, these difficulties stemmed from Japan's unforeseen successes during the first 4 months of war. By March 1942, Japan had either attained all of her initial objectives or was in sight of doing so. Malaya had already been captured after a brilliant campaign that had seen the fall of the great British bastion of Singapore on February 15, 1942. The Dutch East Indies, including the rich resources of Borneo and Java, had survived less than a month longer. The key to securing the Indies had been a series of savage naval battles near Java. There, the Imperial Navy had crushed the combined squadrons of the American, British, Dutch, and Australian navies, the ill-starred Abdiye Command, and then hunted down their fleeing remnants. In addition to capturing the oil and rubber that had been the reason for going to war in the first place, Japan had also ripped apart the last line of defence in front of Australia. The Imperial Navy's fleet was now in a position both to raid Australia's northern coast and to make moves into the Indian Ocean. Similarly, the Japanese campaign in Burma was well in hand and would see the expulsion of the British by the end of April. In the Philippines, the initial landings had gone smoothly, and Manila had fallen on January 2, 1942. American and Philippine forces had retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and were still holding out, but the outcome was a foregone conclusion because the U.S. Navy was in no position to relieve the siege. The entirety of the West Central Pacific Basin, including the American possessions of Guam and Wake, had fallen in the opening weeks of the conflict. Further south, the Japanese had secured the important port of Rabaul, located on the northern tip of New Britain, in January. From there, they threatened to make further inroads into New Guinea, and ultimately to develop offensives to the south and east that could potentially cut communications between Australia and the United States. Thus, on the face of it, Japan had all but achieved all of the goals that she had gone to war for. She had expelled the white colonial powers and secured the southern resource areas in the Indies that would, in time, supply her with all the oil and strategic minerals that her new Pacific empire required. With her earlier conquests in China, she now had under her control a vast territory, stretching from Manchuria in the north, through central China and French Indochina into Malaya and Burma in the southwest. From there, her possessions ran eastward down the line of islands stretching from Sumatra all the way to Rabaul, and proceeded north from there through the stronghold of Truk all the way to the Kurils. In the space of a few short months, the Japanese had thus secured for themselves one of the largest empires in the history of mankind. Japan now stood temporarily supreme in the Pacific. Dutch and British naval power had for all intents and purposes been eliminated from the area, with the Royal Navy having retreated to Ceylon and India. The US Navy had been humbled at Pearl Harbor and bloodied again in the Philippines and around Java. Though unbeaten, it had been incapable of disrupting Japanese offensive actions in the Pacific and was currently able to do little more than conduct hit-and-run raids against Japanese outposts. It had not yet recovered the ability to launch strategically meaningful operations of its own. It could only react to Japanese moves. The Japanese held the initiative everywhere. The logical question that arose in the ranks of the Japanese military's planners as a result of their success was how to use that initiative. It was to this strategic debate that Japan's leadership turned its attentions, beginning as early as January 1942. As it developed, there was widespread disagreement over this subject, not only between the army and navy, but within the navy itself as well. But Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the commander-in-chief of Combined Fleet, was determined to have the final say in Pacific war strategy. Yamamoto, the most controversial and important figure in the history of the Japanese Navy, was a man who defies easy description. He was widely portrayed during the war both at home and abroad as a brilliant commander. However, his reputation within the fleet itself was less clear-cut, despite his considerable pre-war achievements. Born to humble origins, he combined intelligence with an intense drive to better his circumstances. Along the way, he had acquired a taste for the creature comforts of rank, which he would retain until his death. Charismatic and capable, he was also an ambivalent husband and father, enjoying gambling and spending time with geishas instead. Taken together, he was a man of notable strengths and weaknesses, though his personality flaws were not those that would have been detrimental within the social organization of the Navy. What is surprising about Yamamoto is that he had managed to rise nearly to the pinnacle of his profession, despite having been a standard-bearer for some very unpopular causes. He was a supporter of the Washington and London naval treaties, within a navy whose majority considered those agreements to be a slap in the face of national pride, because they pegged Japan's naval forces at a level below those of the United States and Great Britain. He was an advocate of naval aviation at a time when the Navy still worshipped at the temple of the big gun warship. Finally, he was an opponent of Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany, whose martial prowess and antipathy toward the Soviet state were widely admired throughout the Japanese military. Given these facts, two general conclusions can be reached about Yamamoto. First, he must have combined a high degree of confidence and competence along with the survival skills necessary to have reached his present position. Second, he had undoubtedly made a lot of enemies. The forthcoming strategic planning process would swell their ranks still further. Assuming command of Combined Fleet in 1939, Yamamoto had imposed his stamp on it in a way that no commander had done since the days of the revered Admiral Togo. To his detractors, it must have seemed that Yamamoto was determined to make Combined Fleet his own personal fiefdom. His staff became a haven for unorthodox thinkers, including many of the air power supporters within the Navy. This was a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it is undeniable that Yamamoto's advocacy had brought about a greater reliance on naval aviation within the fleet, which had subsequently served Japan well. On the other hand, Yamamoto and his staff saw themselves engaged in a perpetual struggle against the naval establishment. Not surprisingly, he and his officers were unpopular at Imperial General Headquarters, IGHQ, in Tokyo, which thought, somewhat justifiably, that Combined Fleet's commander and cronies had a bit of an attitude problem. Worse was yet to follow. As war approached, Yamamoto laid the groundwork for what was in effect a coup against IGHQ over who was to set strategic direction for the fleet. In so doing, he sowed the seeds of future military defeat by destroying the checks and balances within the Navy's policy-making processes. Yamamoto had insisted in 1941 that if Japan chose to capture the resources of the South through war, that war also had to include the United States. Furthermore, he believed that the US Navy had to be dealt a crippling blow at the outset, so as to buy time for Japan to carry out its operations in the southern campaign areas without opposition. In this view, he was opposed by several senior members of the Naval General Staff, including its head, Admiral Nagano Osami. Nagano was of the opinion that the United States would find it very difficult to go to war if Japan refrained from an outright attack. He reasoned, correctly, that President Franklin D. Roosevelt would have a difficult time rallying sufficient support for a casus belli based only on Japanese attacks against British and Dutch colonial holdings, as American popular opinion was decidedly ambivalent about defending such interests. Nagano had eventually lost the debate, even though his basic reasoning was sound. Yamamoto had won on the basis of both his personal reputation and his willingness to use inelegant means to get his way. In the midst of the Pearl Harbor debate, he had let it be known that he and the entire staff of Combined Fleet were prepared to resign if his views were not confirmed. Nagano, given the choice between acquiescing or confronting his wayward subordinate, had backed down. In so doing, he essentially let Yamamoto hijack the Navy's strategic planning process and place it under the purview of Combined Fleet. Yamamoto would later remark to his cohort Ugaki that, in his opinion, naval headquarters seemed to have no definite ideas as to how to carry out the war. Indeed, during a meeting in Tokyo on 5 December to brief the Emperor, Yamamoto had gone so far as to tell the Chief of the Naval General Staff, as well as the Navy Minister, not to interfere too much and thus set a bad precedent in the Navy. This was, bluntly, a rather incredible state of affairs for any military organization. The Pearl Harbor attack, Hawaii Sakusen, proved a spectacular success, at least superficially. Although it had left some notable loose ends in its wake, including the failure to sink any American aircraft carriers, it had resulted in enough damage to the US Navy that the Japanese greeted it as a great victory. As a result, Yamamoto's political clout within the Navy was considerably enhanced, especially as one Japanese success piled on the next in the heady first months of war. Wherever the Navy had gone, Yamamoto's name by default had gone with it. By early 1942, he was associated by the Japanese public with all the fruits of victory that the Navy had won for the nation. Having taken control over naval strategy, Yamamoto had no intention of relinquishing his new perquisite. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo, of course, had other ideas. Consequently, strategic formulation concerning future operations was accompanied by a tug-of-war between Hashirajima and Tokyo. However, Yamamoto already knew two things. First, his threat to resign had already been effective once. Second, his own political clout had increased dramatically since the inception of the war. Naval GHQ held no such cards. A fractured internal policy-making process was only the first hurdle to the Navy's being able to fashion a reasonable set of follow-on operations in 1942. The second major problem was that the Navy itself did not have unilateral say in such matters. Any further territorial expansion required ground forces to capture and garrison the conquests. The Navy had too few troops to do any real heavy lifting of its own, and therefore had to rely on the Army if it wanted to secure important objectives. The Army recognized that it had an important say in such matters, and it intended to use this leverage. Unfortunately, whereas most nations' inter-service relationships range from bad to worse, Japan's were mired at the dysfunctional end of the spectrum. The Imperial Army and Navy loathed each other, their interchanges being marked by suspicion, pettiness, and outright hostility. Admiral Nagano's penchant, real or feigned, for conveniently falling asleep during joint Army-Navy liaison conferences was indicative of the overall level of civility that prevailed between the two services. The Army was still largely focused on its private quagmire in China, which had consumed the vast majority of its forces since July 1937. Furthermore, given the Army's heavy defeat at the hands of the Soviets during a series of violent border clashes in Manchuria in the summer of 1939, it felt compelled to maintain substantial forces in the area. Thus, it had been parsimonious in relinquishing forces for the initial stage of war operations in the Pacific. In fact, only a shade over 11 divisions had been required to conquer the entirety of the new Japanese Empire. This represented perhaps a fifth of the Army's total manpower. Given that stinginess had apparently paid for itself in the opening campaign, it was loath to release any more forces than it had to for future operations. It was also determined to resist any operational concepts that created open-ended manpower commitments. In fairness to the Army, it rightly wanted to preserve its strength for further actions against the Russians in Manchuria. Despite the mauling the Japanese had been subjected to 2 years earlier, in late 1941, it looked as if the Russians themselves were being overwhelmed. The Red Army had been continually beaten by the Wehrmacht during the previous summer, and to all outward appearances, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. This reversal of fortunes for the Soviet Colossus meant that there might exist real opportunities for the Japanese to seize more of Manchuria. But the net result was that the Army's attention was not fully engaged by the Pacific. This tendency reflected fundamental differences between the Army and the Navy about how the war was to be brought to a close. The Navy was steeped in a tradition of seeking decisive battle with its foes. It believed that landing a single roundhouse blow, if sufficiently powerful, would bring hostilities to a close. It was the Navy's fervent hope, therefore, that the war could be concluded in 1942. The Army, however, held no such illusions, particularly against an opponent as powerful as the United States. Instead, the Army was girding itself for a protracted struggle. It was deeply suspicious of any attempts to increase the size of Japan's territorial holdings in the largely empty wastes of the Pacific, knowing it didn't have the strength to garrison every outpost. Instead, the Army wished to fortify an outer shell as strongly as possible, preparing to make the Americans pay an unacceptable price in blood when their inevitable counterattacks began. As a result, the Army consistently resisted any notions that looked likely to increase its troop commitments in the Pacific. Thus, when the Navy began floating trial balloons during a series of joint service consultations in the early part of 1942, the Army held important trump cards. Lacking naval transport, it could not unilaterally initiate actions against Americans. But by the same token, neither could the Navy, in that the Army had no qualms in vetoing strategic avenues that appeared too risky or that created open-ended commitments. This, then, was the treacherous landscape across which Japan's military leadership groped for a solution to their strategic dilemmas. In such a poisonous political atmosphere, it is hardly surprising that Japan put its carrier force to little strategically meaningful work during the months of March and April 1942. While the internal debate over second-stage war policy raged, the only operations that could be countenanced for Kid Butai were by definition those that did not tread too decisively down any strategic avenue. Thus, Japan was guilty of wasting its most important strategic asset at a time when it was largely unchallengeable in the Pacific. In the eyes of the Imperial Navy, Japan had an array of strategic options open to it at the beginning of 1942. Not all of these alternatives were recognized or developed simultaneously. The sine qua non of success for any of them, though, was the presence of the Navy's fleet carriers. Of course, there were only so many flight decks to go around. As will be seen, the Navy ultimately ended up committing its carriers in support of more operations than they could handle, with disastrous consequences. The circuitous path by which it shouldered these disparate and contradictory commitments was a misadventure of truly epic proportions. The first strategic option was switching over from an offensive to a defensive stance. Rear Admiral Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, was one of the leading proponents of this vision. At this point in the war, Japan had conquered, but it had not really consolidated its gains. It needed time to toughen up its defensive shell and begin preparing for when America would counterattack. Obviously, this could not be accomplished while the defensive perimeter was still being pushed outward. Shifting to a defensive stance would give the fleet time and breathing room to replenish its aircraft and pilots, which were already showing the deleterious effects of an all-out war. Kusaka had a legitimate point, but he was the wrong man to present such a plan. Both he and his superior, Nagumo, had been opposed to the attack on Pearl Harbor. As a result, Kid Butai's two senior officers paradoxically had very little cachet within the fleet. Not only that, but such an approach seemed too passive to be countenanced by a service as habitually aggressive as the Imperial Navy. If a legitimate combat leader had agitated for the same proposal, it might at least have been debated. But coming from a paper pusher like Kusaka, it was dead on arrival. The second option envisioned occupying some or all of Australia. On the face of it, given the size of the objective, this was an outrageous proposal. Yet it actually offered a number of attractions. Though large, Australia was sparsely inhabited and could muster no more than a handful of divisions in its own defence. Its very size meant that the Japanese could be reasonably assured of getting ashore somewhere, since the Australians could not adequately cover their coastline. Even securing the northern portion of the country would create a beachhead on the Allies' most important remaining bastion in the South Pacific. The Japanese were well aware that Australia figured prominently in America's calculations. There were indications that the United States intended to use it as a jumping-off point for operations in the South. Capturing their base would preempt these operations. Indeed, Admiral Nagumo's raid against Darwin was launched partly with such a goal in mind. Attacking Australia was supported by the Plans Division of the Naval General Staff, which was headed up by Rear Admiral Fukudome Shigeru and ably assisted by his right-hand man, Captain Tomioka Sadatoshi. It was also advocated by the fiery Vice Admiral Inoue Shigeyoshi, an air power visionary and now the current commander of the Navy's 4th Fleet, headquartered at Truk, which had authority over operations in the southern region. However, the army quickly nixed this proposal, arguing correctly that it would take a minimum of 10 to 12 divisions to execute. Australia was just the sort of open-ended manpower sump that the Imperial Army wanted at all costs to avoid. Thus, while agreeing that there were benefits to undertaking its conquest, the army asserted that the troops and transports were simply unavailable. Worse, it tweaked the Navy's nose by suggesting that an extension of Japan's campaign this far south would create a theatre of operations that was beyond the nation's logistical capabilities. That the army was wholly justified in its assessment of Japan's already slender logistical base did not help the Navy's temper. A fallback option to an Australian invasion was cutting its line of supply with the United States. To do so, Japan would attack to the southeast through the length of the Solomon Islands. From there, advances would be made into the New Hebrides, New Caledonia, with its important port of Noumea, Fiji, and finally Samoa. By doing so, Japan would sit astride Australia's communications lines, preventing any American build-up. This alternative was seen as less desirable by both Tomioka and Inoue, but they were open to considering it in the event an Australian invasion was dismissed. At the same time, though, Combined Fleet had been quietly contemplating conducting second-stage operations not in the South, but in the Central Pacific. Initial support for this approach came from Vice Admiral Hosogaya Moshiro, the commander with responsibility for guarding Japan's seaward approaches in the north, the path by which an American carrier force could gain easiest access to the Japanese homeland. It was Yamamoto and his staff, though, that were its most forceful proponents. Yamamoto had been haunted by the cardinal disappointment of Pearl Harbor, the failure to sink the enemy flat-tops that by rights should have been moored at Ford Island on the morning of the attack. Instead, for all his efforts, the American carriers had yet to be brought to battle. Yamamoto was determined to destroy them. Knowing that their primary base was Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto believed it only made sense to precipitate a battle somewhere near their lair. Given Pearl Harbor's outcome, Yamamoto had been considering the Central Pacific almost from the inception of the war. On December 9, 1941, he had ordered Admiral Ugaki to re-examine the notion of an invasion of Hawaii. Ugaki was actively working on this by early January 1942. Included in this early operational plan was the concept that a direct invasion of Hawaii would be used to precipitate a decisive battle with the Americans. However, Ugaki admitted to himself shortly afterward that Hawaii's native strength made fighting a battle there extremely risky. It is important to clarify the role of an invasion in these schemes, however. It has commonly been supposed that any successful Japanese operation in the Central Pacific would automatically have culminated in an invasion of Hawaii. Certainly this is what Yamamoto had in mind. However, like the notion of operations in the Central Pacific itself, an invasion of Hawaii was by no means accepted within the Navy as a whole, much less by the Army. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff had been contemplating such a venture since the summer of 1941, but few others had contemplated such a notion. During the planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor, the idea had briefly been floated that a simultaneous invasion also occur against Oahu. However, such an attack was judged by Naval GHQ as being far too risky. In September 1941, the notion was dropped, though it was not forgotten by Combined Fleet. Thus, during the strategic debate that re-emerged in early 1942, Yamamoto and his staff found themselves rolling not one, but two rocks uphill. It didn't take long for both Naval GHQ and the Army to get wind of Combined Fleet's ambitions in the Central Pacific, whereupon Naval GHQ moved aggressively to put a stop to them. On 16th of December, HQ sent Captain Tomioka down to Hashirajima to meet with Ugaki and discuss follow-on operations. While there, Captain Kuroshima Kameto, Combined Fleet's god of operations, briefed Tomioka on operations aimed at seizing Palmyra, a tiny atoll that lay halfway between Hawaii and Samoa. Tomioka initially believed that this move was designed to help support follow-on operations into Fiji and Samoa, which was Tomioka's own favoured axis of attack. Upon returning to Tokyo, Tomioka relayed the results of his meeting to both his boss, Fukudome, and to Fukudome's counterpart on the Army General Staff, Lieutenant-General Tanaka Shinichi. Tanaka saw immediately that Tomioka had been misled and that invading Palmyra was intended as a move into the Central Pacific and a stepping stone toward Hawaii, not Fiji or Samoa. He told Tomioka bluntly that the army viewed any enlargement of the defensive perimeter as dangerous and unnecessary. Captain Tomioka was now on his guard. Highly intelligent and capable, some said arrogant as well, he was not a man to be trifled with. In reaction to General Tanaka's misgivings, he shortly had Captaincy Miwa Yoshitake of Combined Fleet Staff come up to Tokyo to report further on Combined Fleet's plans. Miwa dutifully arrived on 27th December 1941 and delivered a briefing on what was coming to be known within Combined Fleet as Eastern Operation, the invasion of Hawaii. Tomioka, alarmed, saw that he had indeed been given the wrong impression about Combined Fleet's schemes. He thereupon tasked one of his subordinates, Capt. Kami Shigenori, to prepare a logistical study of the proposed operation. Kami dutifully complied, and by 11th January, Tomioka had all the ammunition he needed to shoot Combined Fleet's proposal down. While capturing Hawaii might be feasible, the logistical problems associated with keeping the island's large civilian population supplied were substantial. Hawaii was not even remotely self-sufficient in basic foodstuffs. These necessities, in addition to the needs of the large garrison Japan would have to post there, would require at least 60 transport loads per month, a figure beyond Japan's meagre resources. It was obvious that in the face of likely resistance from American submarines, these basic figures would need to be even further expanded. While Kami was preparing his report, Tomioka was simultaneously working his superiors. At an Army-Navy conference in Tokyo on January 10, 1942, Admiral Nagano discussed the notion of Hawaiian operations with General Sugiyama Gen, head of the Army General Staff. Sugiyama and Nagano agreed that a direct attack on Hawaii was impossible and that operations into the Fiji-Samoa area made better sense. General Sugiyama liked this option because it would require less of a commitment from his branch of the service. Nagano liked it because it was at least an indirect move against Australia. Into this lion's den of stacked deck politics walked Commander Sasaki Akira, a relatively junior member of Combined Fleet Staff, to deliver yet another briefing to Naval GHQ on January 13th. His comrade, Miwa, not having gotten a strong negative reaction to Eastern Operation on his previous trip up to Tokyo, Sasaki was undoubtedly expecting smooth sailing as well. Instead, he was treated to Captain Kami's damning logistics study, followed by the Army's flat refusal to sanction an invasion of Hawaii, and topped off with the announcement of Nagano and Sugiyama's joint accord to proceed into the Fiji-Samoa region instead. Sasaki thereupon retreated to Hashirajima to relay the news to Combined Fleet Staff. Yamamoto and Ugaki were understandably furious at this turn of events, but they had little choice but to temporarily turn their attention to the operational concepts favoured by Tokyo. Yamamoto instructed his chief of staff to flesh out the Fiji-Samoa operation. Ugaki complied, although both he and his staff were unenthusiastic. It is apparent, too, that the notion of operations in the Central Pacific may have been temporarily banished from consideration, but it was never far from either Ugaki or his superiors' minds. Indeed, Ugaki's diary makes it clear that both he and Kurashima continued batting the idea around internally for the next several weeks. However, it was at this junction that a fifth strategic option began its brief rise to ascendancy. Just 2 weeks after Commander Sasaki's demoralizing trip to Tokyo, Ugaki privately confided to his diary that immediate actions against Hawaii were probably impractical anyway, because of its inherent air power, and broached the notion that operations aimed at the Indian Ocean might offer better results. Under this scheme, Japan would move against the British in India, attempting to pry India from British rule by a combination of military action and, it was hoped, a rebellion on the part of the indigenous population. Success in this theatre raised the possibility of effecting a link-up with Japan's Axis partners through the Middle East, thus creating a corridor of fascism across half the globe. It also had the added bonus of being in accord with popular sentiment in Japan, whose press was calling for just such a world-spanning Axis hegemony. By early February, Combined Fleet's staff invited both Naval HQ as well as Army representatives to attend a series of Indian Ocean war games to be held on board Yamato on 2023 to February. The results were mixed at best. Ugaki noted